Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our lively discussion here on the NAR settlement proposals. I want to introduce you to those here in the room for us. My name is Thomas Sadler. I'm with Distinctive Title. This is here is our attorney, David Field, my partner, Jim Darg, and Remax Distinctive Broker, Dan Bouchard is here on the left of me. Welcome everyone, and as people join us, we'll be admitting people into the conference room for our session. Our session is being recorded today. We want to remind everyone that this is an open forum for all real estate agents, not just for Remax Distinctive, but for multiple brokerages and multiple folks, lenders, agents, title, etc. So it's a big, diverse group of folks here joining us. So we want to make sure that it is reminded not to discuss specifics of agent commission, of what your brokerage charges you specifically. Do not speak about those specifics as a reminder. Couple other housekeeping notes. We do have our guest speaker is Keith Howard of Keller Williams. He is our agent mastermind, is going to speak at the end of our session, followed by a quick Q&A. Before we begin, I ask that please identify yourself properly in the chat. If your name is iPhone 12 or iPhone 13, if I can have you rename your phone so we know who's attending our session today. And lastly, we will have a screen share of slides and we'll email that out here at the end of our session today. How it impacts you in your business is the real March Madness. That while this is a big change, not like the sky is falling. The sky is not falling, and I would say only one variable is changing, and that's the buyer agent compensation and how that's displayed in MLS. For me, Thomas Sadler, Chief Operating Officer for Distinctive Title, been in the business for 20 years, licensed in Maryland, DC, and Virginia, third generation. And I'm happy to be with Distinctive Title after about a year and a half here. And we welcome each and every one of you to use our services, be a go-to resource and advocate for you, your business, and your clientele. Distinctive Title, what makes us different? We offer Quality Connect fully. We have a expanded footprint of options for settlement. Wherever your client is, that's where we will be. Whether it's the Roanoke corners of Virginia, Alexandria, DC, Baltimore, as long as we're not crossing the 695 Key Bridge, we'll be just fine. We also offer virtual RON signings free of charge. We do not nickel and dime for our online closings. The most important part there is that it's Jim and I handling those online signings for your sellers. You're not going to be stuck with some notary. It's a settlement agent giving you that detailed professional counsel and advice, knowing that file inside and out at the settlement table. We offer co-branded marketing, whether it's a open house or online demonstrations, we're happy to offer our branding to you and to help you expand your marketing there. We're also expanding into Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Delaware. We're adding those 3 states to our licensing for settlements. Again, our panel today will be featuring David Field. He's our counsel. He's formerly of Champion Title and NBH, licensed here in Virginia, lives here in Virginia, lifelong resident. Also joining us is our Realtor Mastermind, Keith Howard, sharing his insights specifically on buyer agency. And we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. Specifically, broker compensation no longer being displayed in the MLS, how commissions will be negotiated going forward, respect to dual agency and no agency for a buyer, how that will look going forward, and how the power shift will be for listing agents going forward. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. David Field to begin. David, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Your mic is fading in and out. Okay, my name is David Field. I am sure you look right. My name is David Field.
Yes, I have a job.
My name is David Field. I'm an attorney. I'm barred in Virginia. Barred meaning I have a license. Barred in Virginia, District of Columbia, and Maryland. Although I haven't done much in the latter 2 jurisdictions for a number of years, but when I was litigating, I litigated quite a bit in District of Columbia. In any event, yeah, I have been in the title business for 20 years. I worked 17 years at MBH and 3 years at Champion Title. I'm now counsel to Distinctive Title. The first thing I'd say is beware of what you read online about this change, because my wife is sending me articles like, look at this one, look at this one. You don't be too alarmed by what's on there. I mean, some of them are kind of like the sky is falling kind of articles. And as it's been pointed out, I think, or will be pointed out, none of this goes into effect until July if the court agrees to the settlement. My experience in courts probably will agree to settlements that are reached by the parties, like as in this case. So I kind of think that that's probably what's going to happen. They may adjust a little bit. But I think generally the bottom line for realtors is going to be that the compensation is definitely not going to be listed in the MLS anymore. I think what is important from a legal standpoint is, as the former slide said, disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. I think that is what I believe that it's going to be a different marketplace from the standpoint of discussions of compensation. That was kind of baked in to real estate for as long as I can remember. I mean, I started after they started having buyer agents. I think back in the day there were only seller agents. I'm sure somebody here can remind me that that's the case. There was only seller agents, which to me was kind of like when I started this. You're kidding me, because it is, from my perspective. I've done. I try and think sometimes how many settlements I've done. I mean, I say conservatively 1,000 settlements, maybe more. I started back in the boom times, and we were book like crazy in the office I was working in. And we were running 3 conference rooms, eight settlements a day in each conference room. So it was crazy. But I think from both a seller's perspective and probably from a buyer's perspective, especially from a buyer's perspective, it's going to be very important to kind of really have a lot of disclosure about compensation, a lot of discussion about that. I know that the broker agreement on the buyer side always said that the buyer was responsible for the commission. That's not going to change soon, but practice over the years was essentially that the buyer's agent's compensation was baked into the seller side, and the seller agreed to pay, for instance, 6%, and that was going to be split with the buyer's agent. On occasion, the seller wasn't willing to pay that, as probably some of you experienced, so the buyer sometimes would be charged the additional commitment. But as I said, from a legal standpoint, it's really the important part is that you really have to have a lot of discussions. I would say predominantly with your buyers about how the compensation is going to be. Their buyer's agent's compensation is going to be paid, where that's going to come from, and then of course, it's a buyer's agent. But assume you're going to have to kind of talk to the seller's agent and say, what is the seller offering any compensation to the buyer's agent? That's going to be kind of an interesting conversation, I think. So this is all kind of new for all of us. So it's going to be in practicality. It's going to be interesting to see how that all works out. Personal point, I just think it's important. When they talk about people not having agents, having done this for so many years, there have been plenty of times where people are griping about the other agent, the agent bargaining the seller buyer, or their own agent. I've had people try to fire their agent at the settlement table because they were unhappy for some weird reason. But to me, it's like going to court without a lawyer. You don't know what the rules are. You don't know how things operate. You don't know how things work. So the train wrecks I've seen with people not having agents are just because here's the thing. When I was in law school, my contracts professor said that people never come to you before they sign a contract and say, would you read this and see if I should sign it? They only come to you after they've signed it and they say, can you please get me out of this? So that's kind of the same thing with real estate contracts. I think that people are given these things and they're kind of just trusting. I don't think that people really read them thoroughly. They just kind of trust that there's nothing in there that's going to turn around and bite them behind. So I think that's important from the standpoint of having an agent, to have the agent go through the contract with you, because I think most people don't read them. So, I think it's important to have agents. I've always encouraged people to get real estate agents. So I think that people without agents are really kind of got one hand tied behind their back. But in any event, it's going to be an interesting development. Like we say, even if it theoretically starts in July, it's probably not going to develop into the market till later in the summer and maybe even the fall. So we'll just have to see how it goes from day to day, really, because at this point we really don't. We really don't know how it's going to all work out. But I'm working with these gentlemen here, and Jim and Tom and Dan. So if you all have any questions, you can send something to them and they'll forward it to me. Just to be clear, I'm not. When I talk to people about legal things, I'm not, unless they retain me, I'm not really, I can't give them legal advice and say, this is what you should do. But I mean, over the past 20 years, I've heard they have many people call me up and say, what should I do? And I'm always like, well, I'll tell you what I think, but you can't act based on what I've told you.
We'll get to questions.
Yeah. So in any event, but I'm happy to help if you do have a question. We'll see if we can sort through it. Anyway, I think that's probably about my time is up. If anybody has questions, they can put in the chat room. I think we're going to take those at the end of the session here. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, David. We're going to turn now to Keith Howard. Keith Howard's been a realtor for more than 20 years in this in the country. He's originally from Central Valley, California, and Keith has had a long history in this business in different fronts. One I would say is very unique, as he's been a designer. Not many realtors I know can say that they designed homes and then turn to selling them. And Keith has been one of those that has really stood out to me in my career as being one of the most honest, ethical, and sound minds in this business. I applaud Keith for joining us today. Keith, I'm going to turn it over to you real quick after I pause my share and put you on center stage here. Keith, welcome.
Thanks, Tom, for the intro. Yeah, it's interesting as we look at and listen to the media. It's amazing to me how often they get it wrong. And what I'm finding is everywhere I go is I'm getting questioned. What does this mean? What's going on? How's this going to impact your business? Well, I'm getting those questions. I can't go anywhere without getting those, which is a great opportunity. And I really believe we as agents need to be able to answer these questions in basically an elevator speech. You got 30 to 60 seconds where you're going to have to be able to communicate what exactly this ruling means, and it can boil down to that. And also, how do we communicate the value now of a buyer's agent? To me, that is really, really one of the key elements. Is we have to be able to present the value proposition as a buyer's agent, not just to get a buyer to work with us, but to get a seller to accept paying the buyer agency fees. So one of the key things when I think about that is what exactly does a buyer agent do? And a buyer's agent, there's a minimum of 60, 70, 80 different ministerial actions that a buyer's agent does. And I took the time to document them the other day and wrote them down. And I'm sure it's not all inclusive, but I think it was 67, 68 items. And so be able to boil that down and be able to communicate to buyers what functions you're doing, be able to communicate to a seller what functions a buyer's agent does. But also if I'm a listing agent and I have a seller who comes to me and says, hey, I don't have to pay this now. I'm not going to pay this now. Well, I only do business in Virginia, right? So every state's different, but someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always operated as far as dual agency that I cannot give advice or counsel to either side if I'm doing dual agency. So I literally in 20 years, almost $500 million in sales, I have done zero dual agency. But to the seller, I'm going to tell them, I say, listen, if I'm having to do the buyer's functions and they're unrepresented, then I can't charge what I charged before on the listing side. So there's going to be, it still has to be paid. There's still work needs to be done. There's still a value that's there. So we as agents are going to have to be able to make those arguments as individual agents, because each one of us runs our own business. And God help the brokers for keeping us all in line and making sure we're following the new rules. And like they've said, it's a good 4.5 months before this is going to be implemented. So we have some time to get the forms right and get our message down. But right now is the opportunity to communicate the message. To me, it's right now it's a time to I like what the attorney just made the comment, says, would you go to court without an attorney? That's a really good soundbite. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, I mean in a very positive sense. That's a very good anecdotal statement that we can enter a conversation with. And it starts the conversation. And even obviously we can no longer put commission in the MLS. We can do seller concessions that can only go to a buyer. That can be in the remarks. And once again, that's still being sorted out, and different MLSs are still sorting out how they're going to address that. But there's some things that are in play on that. So there's a lot of things that have to be addressed. How do we handle open houses? Okay, if I as a listing agent, there's an agent who wants to hold an open house for me, what disclosures do they need to make? Do they need a buyer broker agreement? Um, those are some questions that are going to be sorted out, I think, in the next few months. But for now, it's full steam ahead. It's keeping doing business with this as in the back of our minds. So I look forward to hearing some of the questions, and between this group, I think we're going to answer a lot of them. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate you very much for joining us again. Switch over back to us as our spotlight. Carrying on from what David and Keith have relayed, again, this is not set in stone. These are proposals. We feel pretty good that these are the proposals that will be enacted, but a lot is to be seen. It's 4 or 5 months into the future. July, right around the corner, but at the same time, that's a lot of time for the legal process to shake out. I would say that the DOJ, one of the questions here is, what do you think the likelihood of the DOJ coming in and accepting this? Well, I would say that the DOJ is not yet responding to the settlement proposal. I think they're still trying to understand what's being suggested, but I also think NAR is putting forward these suggestions with the DOJ in mind. At the heart of it, making these rule changes to avoid a DOJ step in and possible orders from a judge or from the DOJ to stop doing this, stop doing this. So it's proposing rule changes to avoid a heavy hand. We'll see if that's sufficient.
Hey, Thomas, real quick.
Yes, sir.
One of my concerns is how is this going to impact 70-80% of buyers who they can't come up with the extra 15, 20, 25,000, whatever it is. And obviously, how's that going to impact their ability to purchase?
Absolutely.
And how's that going to impact the overall market? Because right now we have in Virginia specifically, we have a supply and demand issue. Okay, we have a lot more demand than we have supply, and this has been going on for 4 or 5 years. Is that going to change if buyers are getting the message, geez, I can't pay that, so I'm not even going to look. So how's that going to impact? To me, that's why I keep on going back to educate, get the word out, use social media, what we can to let buyers know that we have ways of working through this.
Absolutely. Countering, the news media and headlines is a very tough challenge, but I think every one of us who is on the ground living and breathing and working in this industry knows that we've done that before and we'll continue to do so. We have to dictate the narrative as we see it, not as what the media would say it is. That's first and foremost. And then we need some industry leaders. We need Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. We need the VA. We're going to need the lenders to work within the industry once these changes are enacted to allow for possible financing of commission by buyers, allow for larger seller concessions to be allowed. That sort of thing is going to have to be a part of the response to this. One of my points is in talking about, July and what's going to happen. Once this is approved, then you're going to see the local real estate boards start to enact and create forms and dialogue with their agents to allow for these changes to occur. And there could be even more changes. There could be state legislation that comes into play. Maryland does not allow any dual agency. Could we see that in more states? Certainly, we could. So there's a lot still to be seen. And that's part of this discussion is understanding that nothing that's been suggested has been set in stone, but we feel confident that these sort of things are going to be enacted, specifically no compensation mentions in the MLS, and that commission is going to have to be negotiated. Not that it always has been, as we all know, yes, it has been always negotiable, but now it's going to have to be. There's going to have to be a conversation with that buyer. And of course, the seller can still offer compensation, not directly, directly to the buyer agent, not through a compensation or a collaboration between the brokerages.
Go ahead,
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, just two things that come to mind during this discussion. First of all, I kind of agree with Keith. I mean, I think dual agency is just jumping into a minefield because I remember when a lot of that started coming around and they kind of changed the rules about that. You know, if you're a dual agent, you basically put the position of like, I can't tell either the buyer or seller what they should do. You know, and then they're kind of saying, I mean, they're like, what am I paying for? You know, I'm getting no advice. Nobody can tell me anything because they're a dual agent. So now they represent everybody. So that's just kind of I mean, a lawyer can't represent the plaintiff and the defendant at the same time. You know, and there's a reason for that. So, you know, the dual agency is kind of the same kind of situation as that. It just, it implies a conflict of interest, or it just creates, in my mind, a conflict of interest. The other thing is that I think it is going to be, and I've thought about this, is the lending end of this. What the lenders do is really going to be, you know, an important part of how this is handled. Because, you know, I may be wrong about this, but I've always told people that, you know, lender's not going to loan you more money than they think the house is worth. You know, and they're not into like just loaning you money to like finance commissions. So that's going to be kind of a thing to keep an eye on, because to me, that's one of the more important things that we have to look at in terms of how this is going to go forward, is how much money, how much cash on hand does the buyer have? I mean, it always surprised me when I was doing settlements that people much younger than I am, which most people are much younger than I am, would come to the settlement and have like $30,000 or $40,000. I'm thinking, man, when I was 30 or 35 years old, I never saw $40,000. But some people are good about saving money, but you know, they may not have an extra 10,000 or whatever it costs to pay their realtor. So it's going to be interesting to see how the lenders handle that in terms of, you know, concessions, because as you know, with FHA loans, they have to have what, 3% in?
3.5.
3.5, yeah, okay, 3.5%. So that's going to be kind of like, how is that going to happen? So just a thought that that's really something to keep an eye on, as to how the lenders are going to approach helping their buyers purchase a house without them basically going bankrupt.
So Dave, what do you think the chances are? Where do you see the odds of HUD, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, VA changing their guidelines to allow for either the increased level of seller concessions to the buyer in order to accommodate this, or is it going to go in another direction and not allow for this elevated level of concession, and thereby, by not allowing that, it will change the mathematics that goes into the transaction substantially, in a way that will hurt buyers in their ability to be competitive in the offers?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but that's going to be the $64,000 question is because I'm sure many of you had the experience where you negotiated closing cost credit from the seller, and then the lender cuts it back, and the buyer's like, well, gee, I thought I was getting $10,000, now I'm only getting $8,750. What happened? because the lender won't allow that. So that's really going to be, it's going to be a seismic change possibly in terms of how the lenders approach this, because they're either going to have to just say, hey, we're going to do things like we've always been doing them. And then you, as realtors, you just have to figure it out on your end. Or in order to still enable people to get into houses, they're going to have to change their guidelines to some degree. And that, that's going to be tough because, I'm sure you've dealt with as many lenders as I have. They're pretty tough about these things, and they cut these things back and won't allow certain credits and stuff. And so it's going to be tough. I think from that standpoint, like I say, that's going to be, to me, one of the big questions about how this is going to roll out is, are the lenders going to do anything to modify their approach to lending based on the fact that now buyers potentially have to directly pay their own agent? I want to interject one thing, which I think Keith kind of mentioned this in terms of value. I mean, the thing about it is that if you're listing a property and the seller says, I'm not going to pay buyer compensation, well, then who's going to market that property? What realtor is going to say, oh, well, I'm going to bring my guy over anyway, even though I'm not sure I'm going to get paid. So that is the point to bring to the sellers, is like, look, if you really want people, bringing people in and traffic in your house and marketing it and showing it and everything, you just can't say, well, I'm not paying anybody to do that, because then guess what? Like the Joker said in Batman, if you're good at something, don't ever do it for free. You just don't do it. It's just a bad idea.
Keith, go ahead.
To your point, if a listing agent isn't paying or chooses not to pay, then he could be eliminating 80 to 90% of potential buyers that would be interested in his home. Okay, so that will devalue his home. Okay, so in my mind, even now, before all this started, I want that buyer's agent working for us. I want him to bring me a buyer. I want to compensate that brokerage so that they bring me buyers. I mean, that's what we want to do. Because I know if they're bringing me buyers, it's going to escalate the value. The more people look at it, the more chances I want to have escalation clauses and stuff like that. If I eliminate as a seller 60, 70, 80% of the potential buyers out there, it's because they can't pay it. That could be a real issue.
It seems to me that the impetus for the class action lawsuits
was really an antitrust kind of claim.
it was, yeah,
and to me, I read all the pleadings, obviously, or I just got basic knowledge of what went on there. But I think that the perspective was from the consumer was that the commissions were not really negotiable. That or less if you want,
we're talking X%.
Yeah,
we're
right.
talking X%.
X%, whatever X% might, Y%. So if you're saying, and that's what the complaint was about, I'm sure, was essentially that this was kind of a unlawful trade practice, basically, because compensation was fixed and there was no real disclosure that they felt that was being made in terms of the negotiability of that commission. So, anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, and so what I was kind of getting at is, didn't the settlement though, or hasn't the settlements from the various brokerages that have settled and from the NAR settlement, haven't those settlements really honed in on the fact that the compensation will no longer be paid to the brokerage of the opposite side? It's going to be paid to the buyer who will then compensate.
Right.
So we really need to watch our language, right? I'm asking, it's a question.
No, yes.
And we kind of have to watch our language and how we discuss it with our sellers and our buyers so that they understand that no payment is being made to the opposite party, to the opposite brokerage.
Right.
It's being paid to the opposite party to the contract.
Right, exactly.
Is that not correct?
Right, that's correct. And that's like I say, there's a whole discussion. But I want to say from the buyer side, but to me, the whole discussion with buyers and sellers is going to be obviously the amount of compensation and then how they just have to understand the flow of it.
Correct.
You know, that basically
Correct.
we're giving that money to the buyer to pay their agent.
And so in essence, it's a mathematical shuffle.
Right.
It's not really changing the dynamics of the flow. It's what it's doing is it's an accounting change.
Right. It's kind of
It's not really changing the way that the money is actually happening. We're still getting from point A to point B.
right.
We just are changing how it's documented
Right,
in the sales contract. Right. And on the settlement sheet.
If I could bring to mind the legal phrase that I could think of, but it's kind of a change in form, not in substance.
Correct.
You know, it's kind of like the seller's still paying compensation. It's just, you know, it's just like it looks different.
Yeah.
You know, on the settlement statement, it's going to look different.
Correct.
We as agents also need to make sure we start using the words properly, like there's commission, there's also concession. Okay.
Right.
And helping the public understand the distinction between those two. Like I, as a listing agent, will be getting a commission. There's a concession that may or may not be offered to a buyer, and that concession can be applied to their buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Right.
We're going to go ahead for questions. We're going to begin that session now. And I do see Tarifa has a question. We're going to go ahead to bring you on as a spotlight here, Tarifa.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. The concession, how is going to be reflected on the documentation of ELTA, and how is going to be, presented at the settlement, because we know everything must be documented on the document. That's number one question.
That's right. Well, I mean, maybe I want to make sure I missed your point, but I think what you're asking is basically, I mean, the seller concession, let's just assume for this that the seller concession is supposed to include compensation for the buyer's agent. Then you just have seller concession, whatever X is, and then buyer agent compensation is a charge, and that's how it would look on the offer.
Maybe another question, another way to word his question, would it not look like any other seller credit to the buyer?
Yes.
It would look exactly like
just say seller concession.
Seller concession to the buyer of X.
Right.
And if that includes the
agent
compensation as well as the home inspection, repair item,
right,
whatever, then so be it.
Right.
And it would be a culmination of those two things, or
right.
it may be broken down separately. Maybe.
Right. Well, and this is kind of a little bit off point, but just having seen this, if you increase the seller compensation because you find something that needs to be repaired, never write an addendum that says this is being increased by $1,200 in order to make repairs, because that's the sure way to get your loan go down the toilet, right? Now I've seen that before, and I'm like, no, don't do that. Yeah. Just say we're increasing the seller concession to X. Period.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. Second question from James Baer is here highlighted. Do we know if we can offer comp or credit on the info for offer sheet or put it in the doc section?
So Dave may not know what this means. So what James is asking is, in the MLS there is a section of the and this is where we get into the weeds of the settlement.
Right.
And so,
And the MLS.
and yeah, in the MLS, because in the MLS, we have a section that is a section for that's called view documents. And the listing agent can upload a bunch of information, data, all kinds of disclosures, all kinds of information. And one thought is that we could go ahead and put that disclosure the question is could we put that disclosure in those view documents in Bright MLS? And I'm wondering, from my reading, I don't see that there's latitude in the settlement to allow for that. But my question to you is, do you think that would be a possibility? Another possibility is whether or not there would be a field that might be visible to agents, but not visible to the public, that could do the same thing. And again, I think the answer is the same, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I tend to agree with Dan. I think that there is a saying in the law that the court will not let you do indirectly what you can't do directly. So, the idea that well, we can't put it right out there here, but we can put it over here.
Right.
To me, I think you're right.
You can't be half pregnant.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right, exactly. In other words, you can't kind of slide it in over here and say, well, it's not really being listed on the MLS. It's kind of over here because it's basically anything going through the MLS. I think is kind of prohibited from talking about compensations.
So that probably will bring us to how do we communicate it?
Well, yeah, exactly.
How do we communicate?
And that's kind of what I've been wondering about myself.
Yeah, and
I'm not a realtor, but I'm thinking, how's that going to work?
So is that going to be individual phone calls to the listing agent every single time? Or do we simply just put it in an addendum with our offer and say we are asking for the compensation to be X? And
if I could, because we've been having this discussion for last week, and one of the things that I've heard, and I'm about to say I believe it's going to be subject to individual MLS systems nationwide, but that the seller offer concessions. Once again, differentiating commission and concessions. Seller offer concessions can be in the public comment field. Okay, so if we're putting the concessions in the public comment field, I'm being told that is an acceptable place to put it. Okay. In addition, we can advertise through social media, text, emails, that there is seller concessions being paid. Okay. So those are things that I'm hearing right now. I believe that's still subject to the final writing on this, but that's what I'm being told right now, that both the public comment field as well as in our social media posts, our emails, things like that, we can communicate the seller concessions.
Do you see any kind of, in the readings of what you've read, do you see any readings to allow for a public comment in the Bright MLS? I haven't seen that, but
no, I haven't really seen that either. I'm just kind of, I haven't read the actual settlement agreement per se, but I mean, just the overarching theme seems to be, we don't want your compensation in our system.
Right. So to be determined, maybe I think that's yet to be determined.
Yeah.
James had a follow-up question about the need for lenders in a meeting. Well, I got news for you, James. We have several loan officers in this meeting. Shout out to Roy Chowdhury, to Mike Westbrook, to Richard Fagel. Thank you guys for joining us this morning. I see that Roy has a question here, and we're going to answer that. His question is, are we going to see larger firms such as Keller Williams having buyer divisions that offer full service representation for a flat fee? It seems like there's a huge opportunity for the bigger firms to have buyer divisions that work on a fixed cost mode and provide great value for a buyer without charging a percentage such as a flat fee. Go ahead, Dan.
This is an antitrust. This is potentially an antitrust question. So we really can't continue having this numbers discussion. Let's not talk about numbers. The concept is good, but let's not talk about numbers, please.
All right. So could a buyer agency start to develop a buyer program that's a flat fee based for a nominal amount? I don't see any prohibition. I see that as being fair market, but who's going to do it?
Yeah.
Are agents going to want to do that for X amount of dollars? I don't know. I see there being a lot of junior agents, rookie agents being sent out instead of hosting open houses. They're the ones showing the buyer the homes for the first time for that nominal amount. I see that as a possibility. James Bear, you had another question about the timeline for Fannie Freddie VA to make rule changes and adjustments. I feel as though there's going to be a lag time between when the settlement occurs, when the individual brokerages, I'm sorry, not brokerages, the individual organizations for realtors begin to enact their rules, and then the lending institutions will follow suit.
Plus, you're dealing with bureaucracy, so don't hold your breath on it.
That's right.
No,
That's
they're
right.
doing something quickly.
So there's going to be a lot of lag in this, I think, is the overall message, is that while July is around the corner, there's going to be series of changes that go on over time.
Hey, Tom, can I chime in real quickly on the buyer broker agreements? Per the ruling, every time I show if I show a buyer a home, back up. I cannot show a buyer a home now without a buyer broker agreement in place, period. Okay. So historically, some buyers have been reticent about signing on to an agent without really getting to know them, right? So one of the questions that was put to me is, well, how do I address that? And to me, it's like, well, you can very much limit a buyer broker agreement. I can limit it to one property, okay? I can limit it to a week. I can limit it to a number of different things. Now, I think that buyer broker agreement, the way it's written right now, and one of you guys can address it better than I can, I think that's going to evolve. But I can't see it not evolving. There has to be some changes based on the way the ruling came down. But to me, that buyer broker agreement, I may be having one for every property in some cases, because people are not going to want to get signed on with someone until they've worked with them for a while. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's a good possibility, Keith, of having an individual property specific buyer broker agreement.
And that's something that we've all been able to do in the past. So that really doesn't change anything. It may change in practice what we're doing, right? But it doesn't change what we were allowed to do. And sometimes some of us have been doing that for years. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Dan, you have any other questions for David?
Do we have other questions?
I see Tarifa has his hand up. We're going to go to Tarifa real quick.
Thank you, sir. My question, putting everything in one package, compensation or concession, or a credit from the seller to the whatsoever, how we are going to separate like credit to the buyer?
No percentages, no not dollars of compensation, please.
Okay, certain amount is going to come in the contract, okay, for regular contract, repair, whatever you want to call it, and concession is going to be all together in one package, the way I understand the answer for this question. But how we are going to really define this part is for that and this part is for that.
Well, I think that's, I mean, the seller's only gonna offer whatever concession they want to offer. And, the question then becomes, is the seller also, on top of that, offering buyer agent compensation? If the seller is not offering buyer agent compensation, then the buyer agent has to obviously will have negotiated whatever compensation they're going to receive from the buyer, and then explain to the buyer that part of the concession that the seller, explain to the buyer basically that they're obviously responsible for the buyer agent compensation, and which is going to come out of whatever money is on the positive side of a settlement statement. So, you know, I don't know that it's going to be a discussion like, okay, the seller's offering X concession, and my compensation is Y, so therefore what you're really getting is X minus Y in terms of money that you are getting, you know, in terms of concession.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a real discussion you have to have with the buyer as to how those mathematics are going to work out. Because it's just going to show up on the settlement statement as seller concession. Unless and I guess the question is that if the seller is offering buyer agent compensation,
And a seller concession.
huh?
And a seller concession.
And a seller concession, well, there's going to be both listed as separate credits.
Is that gonna be something the lender, that's another question, is what it comes down to?
Oh, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, because basically, I mean, not theoretically, but in fact, obviously, if the seller is offering buyer agent compensation, and there's a charge for buyer agent compensation on the buyer side of the ALTA, then that's just kind of a wash. You know, that's a wash. And so that the lender, that mocks mixed, you know, they don't keep, that's fine with them. But what becomes a little bit more complicated, obviously, is if the seller, which as Keith has said, and you know, I've said, I mean, if sellers don't agree to offer buyer agent compensation, I'm not sure how many people are going to run through their house, you know, because there's no incentive to a buyer's agent to bring somebody to a house that, you know, necessarily. And it depends obviously on the financial situation of the buyer too.
Yeah, for the
Because basically the buyer's like, I'm fine paying your compensation. I've got plenty of dough, not a problem. You know, then obviously the buyer agent is taken care of, and they're going to be able to market the house, knowing that they're going to get paid. So as you can see from my diatribe here, it really gets kind of very complicated. And it's going to be one of these things that's going to have the market's going to have to sort itself out, I think, in terms of how this is all going to work. But I mean, to kind of answer your question, if the seller's only offering a seller concession and no buyer agent compensation, then the buyer's agent has to have that conversation with the buyers to like how that money's going to work out. Do they have additional money that they need to bring, if necessary, to make up the difference?
Real quick, let's just chime in on that. There's a buyer broker agreement in place. So that buyer broker agreement stating what commission, if any, is being paid by that buyer. And that's applied to the ALTA at the end of the day. So if there's a concession offsetting that, that's how it's sorted. And that commission that's stated on, or not commission, if the payment or however you want to phrase it, state on the buyer broker agreement is whatever, however much that is. A realtor cannot earn more than that. Okay, so it's very much defined. It's a very specific number that'll be on that buyer broker agreement. One of the questions coming up is let's say I agree to earn X percentage being a buyer's agent, but turns out the seller's concession offered by that seller is higher than me. that buyer broker agreement is going to limit me. That's the most I can earn as an agent. So one of the questions that's going to come up is, can we amend those buyer broker agreements?
And we don't, I think there's two, that's TBD probably.
Probably, yeah.
That's probably, yep.
I see Jerry,
So much to this currently
You
stuff.
throw a rock into
Yeah.
a pond, you know?
Jerry Hodges, I see you have your hand up. Thank you very much for patiently waiting. What is your question, Jerry?
I would say it's very similar. I would envision it as just as a WDI appraisal, anything on a buyer column, it'll just say buyer agent and paid out a certain number. So if you get whether it's a seller credit for an X amount, whether it's for anything, it doesn't have to specify what it is. It's just going to be seller credit X amount, and it's going to go against the buyer's fees, just like anything else does.
That may be one scenario.
I mean, when we deal with seller
Are
credit,
there any I guess on the lending side, would there be something against that? I guess it would be the only thing that would keep something like that from happening.
Any of our lenders want to speak up on that?
Come on, Richard. I know you're listening.
I do know Roy and Mike Westbrook and Richard Feigl are loan officers here in our meeting, and I see Mike has added a point. Mike, I'm going to read yours. The Redfin CEO seemed overjoyed about ruling during interview with CNBC, there are potential positives for their model, right or wrong, indicating that lesser commission costs, if they're self-sourced, will probably see a lot more internal off-market offerings before going public. I would say that's probably realistic. Is inner office, inner market sales happening. Roy, let's see. Roy says, low inventory environment with numerous buyers, the incentive for a seller to pay a buyer agent would be low. How will a market buyer representation in this environment? Also, as a buyer walks into listings without representation, can they add representation anytime before ratification? I think that last point is a very good point, is if they've seen the house, can they add representation before ratification?
I don't know.
So,
Yeah, I don't see
it's
any.
like you can hire a lawyer anytime you want, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, seller can't prevent you from hiring an agent.
And I don't
I mean-
see how the settlement would change that.
No, but I think that, I guess somehow the thought may be, well, you know, buyer comes in, looks at the house, and the selling agent's in there, it's an open house or something. And they say, yeah, I'm interested. You know, they're free to go out and hire an agent. You know, seller can't say, well, gee, I thought you didn't have anybody, so I was gonna like hoodwink you or something, you know.
And that happens today. That happens today.
Yeah.
Mike Westbrook, again, lender at Intercoastal Mortgage Company, longtime VP there, says he can see concessions, including agent compensation, not being counted as lending concession, but would need to be broken out.
That's what I was saying when we were
And-
talking about that. It's the compensation compared to concession, and the lender may say, okay, well, if that's for this, then they allow it. But that's all we gotta wait to see what happens with the lenders.
Exactly, that's the TBD.
Issues, the seller will refuse to pay the buyer agent. And yeah, that's certainly a possibility until they're under contract. And then if they're under contract and the contract says they will, then they are.
And that's the point. We need to add that to the contract. We have to add the buyer agency fee, whatever that is. We have to add that to a contract. I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess my thought on all this part of this is that, I mean, this is kind of one of the sky is falling questions. You know, I mean, if you read online, I mean, one of the things I read online was a story where it basically said everybody's going to quit real estate now.
Yeah.
You know, just can't make money. You know, can't make money, so I'm going to quit. Because I'm not going to get paid. You know, I don't know that that's really going to happen, and I kind of, even though agents are having these discussions about agent compensation, to me, more in depth than maybe they have historically. But I don't know that suddenly every seller in America is going to go, I'm not paying buyer today. Heck, that I don't have to do that anymore. You know, I just don't see that happening really.
No.
You know.
So we've got a bunch of questions that are pre-populated. We've had a bunch of questions that have already been presented to us that still have not been answered. But if anybody else has any other questions, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I can stop. So one of the first questions, one of the first things that we noted in our company in a previous meeting we had last week was that we can't lead this discussion with our clients with defensiveness or with our prospective clients with defensiveness. As soon as you approach it with an attitude of being defensive about the commissions or defeated, you have already lost the conversation. And so leading with graciousness and leading with grace is the kind of the phrase that I like. Leading the conversation and turning it into a positive discussion, I think, is critical to the whole conversation. The public has a different perspective on the settlement, and we cannot be defensive. We need to be to calmly discuss, so we cannot dilute so that we don't dilute our value. And if we are defensive, we lose credibility. Let's see. The next one is we want to be the experts and need to do the dance in this discussion. Point out information is not found in the headlines. It is in the everyday and can be found in the date and from the experts. So position yourself as the expert in the industry, and don't become defensive about the news headlines that your prospective clients are reading, because they're being bombarded with really bad news coverage.
Yes.
On this topic.
Well,
and we can't become defensive about what they've read. We have to spin it in a positive light. And becoming spin masters is what we kind of have to do in this game.
Like I said, I mean, most of the news articles I've been reading are all kind of gloom and doom, and this is going to be terrible, and you know, things are going to kind of go to the heck of the handbasket. But I also think, maybe it's my opinion, I also think, I hate to use the word I think, but anyway, the phrase, but my thought is that most people aren't following the news that closely. You know, I mean, it's election year. People are kind of tied into that. I mean, I just don't know. I'm not going to assume. I don't know that people should assume when they're talking to buyers or sellers that they've actually even read anything about this at all.
Yeah.
You know,
don't assume it, but if they bring it up,
Yes.
right, then that's where we have
right. Don't, yeah, and that's the point of not going in and going, gee, you know, the headlines are terrible, and you know, whatever, you know, like, I mean, they, like I said, I think a lot of people
We're gonna
tuned out.
We're gonna go ahead to have 3 questions posed. First with Nan. Nan, if I can have you come online and join us.
Hi, thank you all at the table there. First of all, my question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, once the compensation for a listing agent is agreed to and negotiated with the sellers, can the listing agent directly compensate the buyer or the buyer's agent through that compensation? Like, say, you know, we have an agreed amount and I decide to split my amount with the buyer and the buyer's agent. Can we do it? Can we do that? And also, can it be shown on the Alta as it coming from compensation from an agent to agent?
No, I don't think it can, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it can be shown as compensation from agent to agent or brokerage to brokerage.
Or how
But
about
what it
agent,
can't be-
listing agent to buyer?
Correct.
Yeah, that would
That's
that would have to be the way it was shown on the offer.
Correct.
Exactly.
And then we get back into the whole credit thing with the.
Right.
It goes right back into that bucket again.
Yeah, I think that's and that's one of the many issues that's gonna come up is how the lenders are gonna deal with these credits.
And we have to start changing our language. You know, we've become so accustomed to saying, you know, the buyer brokerage credit, the buyer brokerage credit, the buyer brokerage credit. We need to get that out of our language, out of our vocabulary, and we need to start changing it to
Compensation.
to the reimbursement or to that the buyer is the recipient of those funds, and that what the buyer does with those funds in turn is the buyer's business. But that discussion with the seller is only to be, the money only flows from the seller to the buyer.
Right.
So a listing agent couldn't use her part of her agreed to compensation from the seller to list.
That
we
won't
use
exist
part
anymore.
of that?
That won't exist anymore. There won't be a brokerage to brokerage compensation.
No, what she's saying is basically could theoretically her brokerage compensate the buyer, not brokerage to brokerage, but brokerage to buyer to compensate the buyer's agent.
So you're saying the listing agent compensate the buyer?
Yeah, the listing
Yes.
agent shares part of her commission, end quote,
Right.
with the buyer. In other words, the listing agent gives a credit to the buyer.
Just goes back to the.
Can they do that? Yeah, I think they probably can.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
once again, like I say, the issue becomes, and you know, you've all seen it. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, you know, you've seen these fights over credits with lenders and stuff, and how much they're allowed, and how much people got to bring to the table.
That's the issue, yeah.
You know, and then, and obviously, and I mean that's kind of a good solution,
Mm-hmm.
a potential issue.
That's a good one.
But once again, it becomes, you know, if the seller's already offering X number of dollars in seller concessions, and then you load one more credit on there. I mean, I've seen those get kicked off a million times with buyers like, you know, and the thing about it, that had to be something that was clearly right up front in terms of how that was going to operate, so the buyer's lender can look at all that stuff and decide what they're going to allow, what they're not going to allow. And then, you know, and then it becomes problematic if the lender says, I'm not going to do that, you know, we can't have that. You know, then it becomes, you know, that's going to be part of the problem is how these.
There's going to be a lot of creative accounting.
Yeah, right.
Unfortunately, I have to say it that way, but I mean, there's going to be things like if, you know, the seller saying, hey, I'll give you this much for the couch or for, you know, for the, you know, this to be repaired, instead of them giving the concession, it would be like the title company will pay whoever, and then they can still give a concession a separate way. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of.
Yeah, it's going to be a real shakedown in terms of how this is going to go out.
We're going to go to Karen Riccardi. Karen, thanks for joining us this morning. What is your question?
Hi, sure. I'm a little bit confused because I think last week we were talking about calling the listing agent, if you're the buyer's agent, to see is the seller offering any compensation. And this conversation today is that we'll say the seller was offering X to the buyer's agent, but you're saying that you can't pay the buyer's agent. You have to pay the buyer, and that's where I'm confused.
Well, I think that here's the thing: is basically this seems kind of very this is kind of like legal stuff, you know. This is like where you get into like mincing, you know. In any event, the seller, and Dan can jump in if I think I'm wrong. The seller actually is offering compensation to the buyer to pay their agent.
Yeah.
They're not offering compensation to the buyer's agent. So that's the language that is changing. Is like basically if the seller's offering compensation to the buyer to pay their agent. Not like, hi, are you paying like right?
Yeah, I suspect what we're going to see is the listing agreement change and the buyer agent agreement change. Right now, what we've got is the listing agreement breaks out what the listing agent's compensation is going to be and what the buyer's brokerage compensation is going to be. Well, I think that second section is going to be eliminated from the listing agreement. And that's not going to be part of the listing agreement anymore.
Right.
So the money that's going to flow to the listing brokerage is going to stay at the listing brokerage, probably. Now, whether or not there will be a prohibition on whether or not the listing agent can give money to the buyer, I don't know. I mean, that's a question that'll go to the lawyers, and that might be a TBD answer. Yeah. But I think that, yes, what we discussed last week is that the money can only flow to the buyer. It cannot go to the buyer's brokerage.
Yeah, it's another legal phrase. It's a distinction without difference. You know, basically the buyer's agent gets paid technically by the seller, but the difference is the distinction is that really is going to the buyer to pay their rate.
And the reason it has to go that route in my mind is because remember there's a buyer broker agreement in place that if that agent's involved with the buyer, there's a buyer broker agreement in place, and that buyer's paying that agent. So if the buyer's paying that agent, that those funds are going to the buyer, and then the buyer's paying the agent.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Well, title company's actually paying the agent.
Hey, that's us.
Yeah, right.
We're going to have one last question before we wrap up, and that is from Kathy Rehill. Kathy, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, hey, everybody. So it sounds like we'll be probably submitting our buyer agent agreements to the settlement company so that funds can get dispersed. And that we'll be seeing a change to the listing agreement where it removes the co-op brokerage for the buyer's agent, but perhaps we get our sellers to sign in that agreement that in fact they are going to offer a concession of a certain percentage to the buyers at settlement. Does that sound right?
So right now,
how else do you hold the seller accountable?
Right. So right now, agents report to us commission. And you know, it's been an honor system, but I've definitely had mistakes or I've had errors in belief of what was the correct commission. And we back that up with the buyer agent commission. The buyer agent agreement or the listing agent agreement. Those have on occasion been sent to us. I can see that becoming the norm. And then it is up to the title company to interpret. No, I wouldn't say we're going to be the decider of who's right and who's wrong. We don't want to get into that business. But if there is a uniform agreement on what the commission is, it shouldn't be an issue. But I can certainly see there being disputes and a lot of confusion, especially if you have the situation of a property specific buyer agreement. You get very, very used to it being a certain way, and now it's, well, on this particular deal it was this, and this particular deal it was this. My preference, I would love for a commission to be disclosed in the sales contract. Buyer agent is this, listing agent is this, and here's the seller compensation for that. Buyers paying their agent, sellers paying their agent.
And I think that's what the settlement is calling for.
Correct.
I think the settlement is calling for, regardless if the seller states up front and says they're going to pay X, I think the contract is going to have to state it, to restate it, or to clarify it, or to amend it. So the driving document is going to be the sales contract. So it might become a moot point in terms of disagreeing between the listing side and the buying side, because it's going to be written in the sales contract.
I would love for that to be the norm.
You know, I can see, at some point, because they like to fool with the contract so much, the, NVAR coming up with some, language, you know,
Mhm.
putting in place next January 1st, from now on, the contract's gonna say this
Right.
about how that compensation is gonna flow, just so it's clear. Because I think that, my humble opinion as an attorney, it's always been dangerous for people to write in stuff in contracts that are not pre-written. I mean, the reason the contract's pre-written is for many reasons, but you know, writing a contract or adding language to a contract it's just, you have to be so careful about how you write it. You know, I mean, I've, you know, and if it's, and here's the thing is, if it's ambiguous, if you're the buying agent, you're the selling agent, and you write something in that contract that's ambiguous, it will be construed against you. If, you know, if it's, sorry, I should be looking over here. If it's ambiguous, it's gonna be construed against the drafter. So that kind of puts you in a position where you have to be, and I've always told people, I don't think people do it, I've always told realtors, look, if you write something additional into a contract, have somebody else read it and tell you what they think it says.
Might your point be, might an example of your point be that if you write into the contract, buyer brokerage compensation will be X, and that implies that the seller is paying the buyer's brokerage. Might that be an example of ambiguity?
Right. Well,
that could be used against you?
Well, that's more of an example of basically where you basically set out that the seller's paying the buyer's brokerage.
Exactly.
And that's what
with it being incorrect, technically incorrect.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, somebody. I don't know if this might happen, but certainly somebody could object and say, "Hey, that's an illegal. You know, that's contrary to law now, or contrary to what you can do. So we don't have to pay it because you basically written an illegal contract."
Exactly.
You know, and that, you know, that's kind of, I mean, my best example of this in terms of writing these things is one of the agents I used to work with for many years. Home inspection came back and said that the roof was in really bad shape and it needed some shingles probably need to be repaired, but really the roof is going to need to be replaced, and that the buyer should start setting aside money to replace the roof. And then the agent for the buyer wrote in the addendum, you know, roof to be repaired per home inspection. And so then the buyer said, "Where's my new roof?" You know, because it basically said the roof needed to be replaced, and the selling agent, the listing agent was like, "Oh my God, you know, we didn't agree to replace a new roof." I'm like, "Well, you kind of did, because you basically said we're going to do what the home inspector said to do." So, I mean, and that's kind of an innocuous thing where you thought, well, gee, that's like normal. Okay, we're going to do what this home inspector said, but the home inspector was kind of ambiguous to some degree, because he said, "Well, you know, you can put a couple of shingles on there, but it really needs to be replaced." So that's the kind of thing where you know, you can kind of get into a trap where if you're not paying attention to what you're writing, you know, you end up buying a new roof.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining our discussion this afternoon. Is it afternoon yet? No, it's still morning.
Pretty close.
Still morning.
Morning.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. We greatly appreciate your time and your questions and learning more about this settlement agreement proposal. And there's certainly going to be more to come over the next few weeks and months ahead. Please stay tuned to us, to your agents, to your brokers. We hope that this has been informative for you. And of course, if there's any follow-up questions, we'll take them offline. We'll see you at our next settlement. Take care, everyone.
Bye all.